Hi there, and welcome to Coo English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. George Orwell, Truth, Power, and the Pen. Chapter 1. A Boy Named Eric. Long before the world knew him as George Orwell, he was born Eric Arthur Blair on June 25, 1903, in Motihari, a small town in British-ruled India. His father, Richard Walmsley Blair, worked in the Indian Civil Service, managing the British government's control over opium exports. His mother, Ida Mabel Limousin, came from a French-English family with artistic and social connections. Though not wealthy, the Blair family belonged to the lower upper middle class, a term Orwell would later use with irony and accuracy. From the beginning, Eric's life was shaped by two worlds. One was colonial India, where his father worked in a distant and structured empire. The other was England, where he would spend most of his life, yet often feel like an outsider. When Eric was still an infant, his mother brought him and his older sister Marjorie back to England, hoping for better education and opportunities. His father stayed in India, and Eric would not live with him again until many years later. This separation, common in colonial families, left a quiet mark on the young boy. The Blair family settled in Henley-on-Thames, a modest town near London. They lived in a small house, not rich, but respectable. Eric grew up reading books, exploring the countryside, and observing people. He was a curious child, sharp-eyed and thoughtful. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words were often serious, even as a boy. At the age of 5, Eric began his formal education at a small Anglican parish school. He was bright, often ahead of his classmates in reading and writing, but it wasn't until he entered St. Cyprian's School, a private boarding school in Sussex, that his true intellectual and social challenges began. St. Cyprian's was strict and expensive, but Eric was sent there on a reduced fee thanks to a scholarship. This meant he had to be better than the others, not just to learn, but to prove that he belonged. The school valued discipline, patriotism, and gentlemanly behavior. Eric, however, didn't fit easily into this mold. He disliked the social snobbery and felt humiliated by the way poor students were sometimes treated. Yet, even there, he stood out. Teachers noticed his talent for writing, and his essays often impressed adults with their clarity and insight. Despite the pressures, young Eric was quietly forming ideas that would later shape his work as George Orwell. He was already questioning power and privilege. He learned how people obeyed rules not because they believed in them, but because they feared punishment or shame. He also learned how language could be used to hide the truth or control others. Books were his refuge. He loved the adventure stories of H.G. Wells and the honesty of Charles Dickens. He also read Kipling, Chesterton, and even ancient Greek fables. His imagination was large, but his view of the world was not romantic. He saw cruelty where others saw order. He noticed lies behind polite words. In letters from this time, Eric described himself as lonely. He didn't make many friends. He felt the pain of not belonging fully to any group, not rich enough for the upper class, not poor enough to be dismissed. This quiet in-between space became his permanent place as a writer, always observing, never fully included. His school years were both painful and important. At Eton, the elite school he later attended on another scholarship, he refused to join the intellectual games that most boys played to impress teachers. He preferred to think independently, sometimes writing sharp critiques of tradition. At Eton, he also began writing poems and short stories. Though not yet famous, he was already practicing the kind of writing that would later shake the world. Looking back, Orwell described his childhood as full of discomfort, not physical, but emotional and social. He wrote that he had a strong sense of failure even when he was young, yet this sense of not fitting in became a gift. It gave him the eyes of a rebel, the heart of an outsider, and the courage to speak truths others avoided. By the time he finished school, Eric Blair had developed a deep dislike for social injustice, a powerful love for clear writing, and a habit of seeing through lies. He didn't yet know he would become George Orwell, but he already carried the seeds of the writer. He would be honest, bold, and unafraid to challenge the world. Chapter 2. The Policeman Who Questioned Power. After finishing his studies at Eton, Eric Arthur Blair did not follow the usual path of his classmates. Many of them went on to Oxford or Cambridge, some prepared for careers in law, politics, or business. But Eric, who had no money for university and no clear career plan, made a surprising decision. He joined the Indian Imperial Police. In 1922, at the age of 19, Eric sailed to Burma, now Myanmar, one of Britain's colonies in Southeast Asia. The British Empire still stretched across large parts of the world, and Burma was one of its faraway jewels. As a colonial officer, Eric was expected to help maintain British control, enforce laws, and keep order among the local people. He spent 5 years in Burma, working in several towns, sometimes in remote and difficult conditions. His responsibilities were heavy. He had to deal with crime, riots, and political unrest. He often had to give orders to people older than him and from a completely different culture. His uniform gave him power, but inside, he felt uncomfortable with that power. At first, Eric tried to do his job well. He believed in duty and discipline, but the more he saw, the more disturbed he became. He saw the cruelty of colonial rule, the racism, the violence, the fear. British officers lived in comfort, while the local Burmese people were often treated as second-class citizens. Laws were applied unevenly. Respect was demanded, not earned. And the British system did not encourage understanding. It demanded obedience. Eric began to feel ashamed. He wrote in his later essays that he hated the empire he served. Yet he also admitted that he hated the people he ruled. Because of the hatred they felt for him, it was a cycle of bitterness, and it was tearing him apart inside. One of his most powerful early essays, Shooting an Elephant, was based on an incident during this time. In the essay, a young officer is called to deal with an elephant that has gone wild. He doesn't want to kill the animal, but a crowd gathers, expecting him to act. In the end, he shoots the elephant, not because it is the right thing to do, but because he feels trapped by the crowd's expectations. The story is simple, but its meaning is deep. It shows how people in power often make terrible choices just to avoid looking weak. It also shows how those who seem to be in control may actually be prisoners of the system they represent. The elephant becomes a symbol of empire, and the officer a symbol of moral confusion. This inner conflict would become one of the central themes in Orwell's writing, the struggle between what is right and what is expected. In Burma, Eric Blair began to understand how systems of control not only hurt the oppressed, but also damage the hearts and minds of those who enforce them. After 5 years, he resigned from the police force. He was only 24, but the experience had aged him. He returned to England, not as a proud officer, but as a man searching for truth. He decided he would become a writer. He didn't yet have a famous name. He didn't yet have a clear path, but he had one thing that mattered, the need to tell the truth, even if it hurt. To begin his writing life, he chose to live in poverty. He moved to London and later to Paris. He stayed in cheap lodgings, took small jobs, and spent time with people society usually ignored, dishwashers, beggars, homeless men. He didn't just observe them, he lived among them. He wanted to understand how the poor survived. He wanted to see the world from below. These experiences became the material for his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London. It was published in 1933 under a new name, George Orwell. He chose George for its English everyday sound and Orwell from the River Orwell in Suffolk, a place he loved. The name was simple, honest, and strong, just like the voice he wanted to writing. The book described the hardships of poverty with detail and dignity. Orwell did not romanticize suffering, but he gave voice to those who had none. He showed that poverty was not a sign of weakness, but often a result of an unfair system. The book was well received, especially for its honesty and direct style. Orwell had found his voice and a new purpose. From a privileged schoolboy to a colonial officer, to a man sleeping in the streets, Orwell's early adult life was full of change. but each step brought him closer to the writer he was becoming. He had learned what it meant to live under authority, he had seen the faces of injustice, and he had begun to turn experience into language. What made Orwell different was not just his talent, but his courage. He went where others were afraid to go, not just physically, but morally. He asked hard questions. Who has power? Who suffers? Why do people lie? And most importantly, what is the truth? These questions would guide him for the rest of his life. Chapter 3. A Writer Among the Forgotten. When George Orwell began his writing career, he had no fame, little money, and many doubts. He was not trying to become rich. He was not even sure he could survive as a writer. What he wanted, more than anything, was to tell the truth, especially the truth that others tried to hide. After publishing Down and Out in Paris and London in 1933, Orwell continued to explore the lives of people on the edges of society. He believed that a writer's job was not only to describe the world, but to expose injustice. This belief would shape everything he wrote. During the early 1930s, the world was going through a crisis. The Great Depression had left millions jobless. In England, many families could not afford food or housing. Orwell wanted to see how ordinary people were affected. So, he traveled north to the industrial towns of England, places like Wigan, Barnsley, and Sheffield. These were coal mining towns, full of hard work and harder lives. Orwell lived among the workers. He went down into the mines. He spoke with families in cold, dirty houses. He took careful notes on what he saw, how people ate, where they slept, and how they survived. What he found shocked him. The miners worked in dangerous, exhausting conditions. Their pay was low, and their homes were often falling apart. Many families shared toilets. Children had no shoes. There was hunger, sickness, and hopelessness. Orwell did not simply describe these facts. He asked why. Why did such conditions exist in a rich country? Why did the upper classes ignore the suffering of others? And why did the system keep poor people poor? He put these thoughts into his 1937 book, The Road to Wigan Pier. The first half of the book described what he had seen, the dirt, the danger, the despair. The second half explored his own ideas about socialism. Orwell believed that capitalism had failed the working class. He thought socialism, if practiced honestly, might offer a fairer system. But he also criticized how some socialists acted. He said that many middle-class supporters of socialism did not really understand the poor. Some spoke in complicated language. Others acted as if they were morally better. Orwell believed this pushed ordinary people away from the cause. The book caused debate. Some praised its truthfulness. Others disliked its political comments. But one thing was clear. Orwell was not afraid to speak his mind. He had become a writer of conscience, someone who cared more about truth than popularity. At the same time, Orwell was changing as a person. He no longer lived among the homeless, but he never forgot them. He had a deep respect for those who worked hard and suffered quietly. He believed that writing should give these people a voice. In 1936, another event would shape Orwell's life even more deeply, the Spanish Civil War. Spain was in crisis. A right-wing military group, led by General Franco, tried to take over the government. In response, people from around the world came to Spain to fight against fascism. Orwell was one of them. He arrived in Spain in December 1936. At first, he joined a small militia group that supported the workers' revolution. He was not a soldier, but he wanted to help defend democracy and stop the rise of fascism in Europe. Orwell fought at the front lines. He lived in rough conditions, ate poor food, and faced real danger. In May 1937, he was shot in the throat by a sniper. He nearly died. The bullet missed his main artery by just a few millimeters. While recovering, Orwell saw something that shocked him even more than the bullet: betrayal. In the cities behind the front lines, the groups who were supposed to be allies began fighting each other. The Soviet-backed communists accused other left-wing groups of being traitors. People were arrested, newspapers were shut down, and lies were spread. Orwell realized that even the side fighting for justice could be corrupt. The truth was being hidden by both sides. he returned to England, disillusioned but determined. In 1938, he published Homage to Catalonia, a personal account of the war in Spain. The book was honest, powerful, and deeply critical of how politics could twist the truth, but at the time, it was not widely read. Many people on the political left did not want to hear Orwell's message. They wanted unity, not criticism. Orwell, however, refused to be silent. For him, truth mattered more than loyalty to any group or party. By the end of the 1930s, Orwell's health was worsening. The injury to his throat had lasting effects. He also suffered from tuberculosis, a serious lung disease. But he continued to write, always guided by one goal, to help people see what was real. In those years, Orwell sharpened his style. He avoided complex words and long sentences. He believed that clear writing was a way to fight lies. Good prose, he wrote, is like a window pane. You should be able to see through it, straight to the truth. His essays during this time, on language, class, politics, and culture, showed a sharp mind and a deep moral sense. He was becoming not just a writer, but a thinker. He didn't write for the rich or powerful. He wrote for the curious, the skeptical, and the honest. By the late 1930s, Europe was moving toward another world war. Orwell had seen fascism in action. He had seen how lies and fear could shape people's minds. He believed that a new kind of danger was rising, not only from bombs and bullets, but from the loss of truth itself. The years ahead would push Orwell to his limits, but they would also lead him to write the books that would define his legacy. Chapter 4. Truth in a Time of War. By the late 1930s, the world was standing on the edge of another great conflict. Adolf Hitler had taken power in Germany. Fascism was growing in Italy and Spain. The Soviet Union, once seen by some as a workers' paradise, was now ruled by fear and control. In Britain, people hoped for peace, but Orwell knew that hope alone would not stop the storm. He could see what others ignored. He had seen lies used as weapons. He had seen people punished not for what they had done, but for what they believed. And now, as World War II approached, Orwell felt that his writing had a new purpose: to protect truth. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain declared war. Orwell was too sick to be a soldier. His lungs were weak from tuberculosis. Still, he wanted to serve. He joined the Home Guard, a local defense group, and later worked for the BBC, creating radio programs to explain the war to listeners in India and other parts of the British Empire. But Orwell was frustrated by his work at the BBC. Much of it felt like propaganda, polished words hiding uncomfortable truths. He once joked that working there was like wasting your time at a girls' school. The censorship and careful messaging troubled him deeply. At the same time, he was writing articles and essays that stood out for their honesty. In them, he warned that war could make people blind. He wrote about the dangers of nationalism, the belief that one's country is always right, even when it does wrong. He saw how governments use fear to control people and how language was twisted to hide crimes. These experiences shaped Orwell's view of totalitarianism, a system where the state controls every part of life. In such systems, he believed, the greatest danger was not violence, but the destruction of truth. In 1941, Orwell published The Lion and the Unicorn, Socialism and the English Genius. It was part essay, part political vision. He argued that England could not survive the war unless it reformed itself. He called for a form of democratic socialism, one that cared for all citizens, not just the rich. He wanted a fairer society, but one rooted in freedom, not in the kind of cruel control he had seen in Spain and the Soviet Union. As the war dragged on, Orwell faced personal tragedies. In 1945, his beloved wife, Eileen, died suddenly during surgery. They had adopted a baby boy, Richard, just 1 year earlier. Orwell was left alone, grieving and raising a child while battling illness. Amid this darkness, he wrote a book that would change his life and the world. In Animal Farm, Orwell used animals on a farm to tell a political story. The pigs represented leaders of the Russian Revolution. At first, the animals rise up, seeking freedom. But over time, the pigs become as cruel as the humans they replaced. The famous line, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others," showed how even ideals like equality could be twisted. Orwell had trouble finding a publisher. Many companies feared the book would offend the Soviet Union, which was still an ally during the war. But in 1945, Animal Farm was finally published, and it was a huge success. Readers understood the message. Power can corrupt, and revolutions can betray their own dreams. The book made Orwell famous, but fame did not make him rich or happy. He still struggled with money. His health was getting worse, and the world was changing again, this time in more frightening ways. In the years after the war, two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. A new conflict began, the Cold War. It was not fought with bombs, but with secrets, spies, and fear. Governments spied on their own people. They controlled the media. They punished those who asked questions. Orwell watched this with deep concern. He believed that in this new world, the biggest weapon was not a gun, but language. Words could be used to hide truth. History could be rewritten. Lies could become facts. He began to write the most important book of his life. The idea had lived in his mind for years. A world where the government watches your every move. A world where people are forced to believe what is not true. A world where language itself is changed, so that wrong ideas cannot even be spoken. He called it 1984. Orwell moved to a remote island in Scotland to finish the book. The weather was harsh, and he was very ill, but he worked day and night. He poured all his fears and knowledge into the story. He imagined a future where a party controlled everything. The party changed history books. It created a new language called Newspeak, which removed words like freedom and justice. It used screens to watch people, and it taught citizens to love their master, Big Brother. The main character, Winston Smith, tries to resist. He wants to remember the past. He wants to speak the truth. But in the end, he is broken, not just his body, but his mind. He is forced to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. It was a painful book to write and a painful one to read, but Orwell believed it was necessary. When 1984 was published in 1949, it caused a shock. Some called it a masterpiece. Others called it too dark, too hopeless. Orwell had captured something real, the fear that truth itself could be destroyed. By the time the book was released, Orwell was very sick, but he had finished what he needed to say. He had spent his life fighting lies with pen and paper, with courage and honesty, and though his body was weak, his voice had never been stronger. Chapter 5. The Pen Against Power. George Orwell believed that clear writing was a form of resistance. In times of deceit, he wrote, telling the truth became a revolutionary act. This belief pushed him to write two of the most influential books of the 20th century, Animal Farm and 1984. After the personal loss of his wife Eileen in 1945, Orwell was left emotionally shaken and physically frail. But his creative fire burned fiercely. He had little time, and he knew it. Every word he wrote had to matter. It was during this period of loneliness and illness that Orwell completed Animal Farm. On the surface, it looked like a simple story about animals taking over a farm. But beneath that surface was a powerful warning about revolutions that betray their ideals. In Animal Farm, the animals rebel against the human farmer, hoping to create a just and equal society. At first, the revolution brings hope. But over time, the pigs, led by the cunning Napoleon, take control. They change the rules, twist language, and rewrite history. Orwell had trouble finding a publisher. Many editors were afraid of upsetting the Soviet Union, Britain's ally in World War II. But eventually, Animal Farm was published in August 1945, just as the war was ending. It became an instant success. The book was short, sharp, and unforgettable. For many readers, it was their first introduction to the dangers of totalitarianism, not just in faraway lands, but in the ideas and institutions close to home. Orwell had turned political theory into a story that even schoolchildren could understand. But Orwell wasn't finished. He had seen the rise of fascism and the betrayal of socialism. Now, He feared a new kind of threat, one that didn't come with boots and guns, but with silence, lies, and control over thought itself. He began writing 1984, his darkest and most ambitious novel. To complete the book, Orwell left London and moved to the remote Scottish island of Jura. The air was clean, but the living conditions were harsh. The wind blew constantly, the roads were poor, and Orwell's health continued to worsen. He was battling tuberculosis, often coughing blood and suffering from fever. Yet, he refused to stop writing. In the solitude of Jura, Orwell created the world of Oceania, a grim future where a powerful party controls not only the actions, but even the thoughts of its citizens. At the center of this world is Big Brother, a mysterious leader who may or may not exist. The party watches everyone through telescreens, rewrites history daily, and even invents a new language called Newspeak to limit how people think. The story follows Winston Smith, a quiet man who secretly hates the party. He tries to rebel, to remember the past, and to love freely. But he is caught, tortured, and broken. In the end, he accepts the party's lies, even believing that 2 + 2 = 5. 1984 is not just a novel, it is a warning. It asks, what happens when truth disappears? What if we forget what freedom feels like? And what if people lose the words to describe rebellion? When the book was published in 1949, it shocked readers across the world. It was not just a story, it felt like a prophecy. Orwell's vision of total control, of history rewritten by power, seemed terrifyingly possible. Governments took notice. The Soviet Union banned the book. In the West, 1984 was praised, but sometimes misunderstood. Some people saw it as a warning about communism only, while Orwell had meant it as a warning about any system that crushed the individual, left or right. By now, Orwell's health had collapsed. He was living in a hospital, too sick to walk outside, but still writing letters, reviewing books, and planning future works. Fame had come, but it did not bring comfort. He lived simply, often alone, surrounded by books, notebooks, and thoughts. And yet, despite his illness, Orwell remained focused on truth. He believed that words mattered, that clear, honest language could fight lies, that even if power wins today, the truth must still be spoken. His books became tools in that fight. Animal Farm and 1984 were translated into dozens of languages. They were read in classrooms, discussed in parliaments, banned in dictatorships, and quoted by protesters. His stories crossed borders, speaking to people in every corner of the world. But Orwell never saw the full extent of his influence. He died in January 1950, just months after the publication of 1984. He was only 46 years old. Yet, in those short years, he had done something extraordinary. He had taken simple words and made them powerful. He had used fiction to tell the truth. He had shown the world that freedom depends not just on laws, but on honesty, memory, and the courage to speak up. His warning echoes through time. Every generation finds something new in his books, because the dangers he described never fully disappear. New forms of power rise, new lies are told. And still, Orwell's voice reminds us, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. His words remain like a lighthouse in a storm, clear, bright, and unwavering. Chapter 6. A Voice in the Fog. By the time 1984 was published, in 1949, George Orwell had become more than a writer. He had become a symbol of truth-telling, of resistance, and of the lonely struggle to say what others feared to say. Yet behind that symbol stood a man, fragile, grieving, and desperately ill. After the death of his wife Eileen in 1945, Orwell had grown increasingly withdrawn. He was now a single father to their adopted son, Richard. Though Richard was mostly raised by relatives during Orwell's long periods of illness, friends described Orwell as kind but distant, someone who could be both warm and difficult, generous and severe. In public, he was respected. In private, he was often alone. He never stopped writing. Not because it made him happy, it rarely did, but because he believed it was his duty. Orwell once said that all writers are vain, selfish, and lazy. Yet he wrote with discipline and purpose because he believed that writing mattered more than the writer. The setting of Jura, a remote island in the Scottish Hebrides, seemed perfect for someone seeking isolation. Orwell moved there in 1946, hoping the clear air would ease his tuberculosis. The island was beautiful, with wild landscapes, rocky cliffs, and powerful winds that blew through the house like ghosts. There was no telephone, barely any electricity, and few visitors. The silence helped him focus, but it also made him face the quiet fear of death. Orwell's days on Jura followed a simple, harsh routine. He wrote during the day, often wrapped in heavy clothes, beside a fireplace. At night, he read by lamplight or wrote letters. He grew his own vegetables and fished in the cold sea. His illness grew worse, but he refused to stop. He would often cough for hours, sometimes spitting blood, but then return to his desk. In letters to friends, Orwell never asked for pity. He wrote about politics, literature, and everyday life. He wanted to stay part of the world, even as it began to slip away from him. Despite his illness, Orwell remained sharp and passionate about the state of society. He worried about how language was being misused in politics, how lies were being accepted as facts, and how people were slowly losing the ability to think critically. These fears shaped every page of 1984. The book was completed in late 1948. Orwell's health was failing, and he knew it. He typed most of the manuscript himself, often while lying in bed. Every word was a struggle, but when the final draft was finished, he said he felt relieved, like someone who has just vomited something poisonous. He had poured his fear and vision into the book, and it had nearly destroyed him. 1984 was published on June 8, 1949. It was immediately recognized as a masterpiece. Reviewers were stunned. Some called it brilliant. Others called it terrifying. Most agreed that it was one of the most powerful books of the century. The novel's ideas, Big Brother, Newspeak, Doublethink, entered the public mind. Orwell's nightmare vision of a world where truth is erased and thought is controlled became part of how people understood politics and power. But Orwell himself did not celebrate. He was in a hospital in London, his weight dropping, his lungs failing. Fame had come, but joy had not. He continued writing short essays and reviews even from his hospital bed. He dictated letters, argued with editors, and read newspapers. He even began planning his next novel, a story about a group of men in colonial Burma. He never got the chance to begin. In the final months of his life, Orwell did something unexpected. He proposed marriage. Sonia Brownell was a young, smart, and elegant woman who worked as an editor at Horizon, a literary magazine Orwell respected. She was familiar with his work and admired his honesty. Orwell, in turn, admired her intelligence and strength. Though the marriage surprised many people, Sonia agreed. They were married in the hospital in October 1949. Orwell, dressed in pajamas and a robe, smiled for photographs in his hospital bed. For a brief moment, there was warmth in his cold, gray world. Sonia promised to protect his work and legacy. She kept that promise. Orwell died just 3 months later, on January 21, 1950. He was 46 years old. He left behind a son, a widow, and a body of work that would shape generations. His funeral was quiet, in keeping with his wishes. No grand speeches, no elaborate ceremony, just a few friends, a grave in the English countryside, and a man who had spent his life searching for the truth. In the years that followed, Orwell's reputation grew. His books were translated into dozens of languages. Animal Farm and 1984 became required reading in schools around the world. His essays, once published in small magazines, became classics of modern thought. More than anything, people respected Orwell, not because he was always right, but because he always tried to be honest. He challenged both the right and the left. He stood alone when others followed the crowd. He believed in ordinary people and in their right to live free, think clearly, and speak the truth. His life was not easy. He struggled with poverty, sickness, and loneliness. But through it all, he kept writing. He once wrote, "Writing a book is a horrible, exhausting struggle, like a long bout of some painful illness." Yet he chose that struggle because he believed it was worth it. Even today, Orwell's words feel alive. They warn, they question, they challenge us to stay awake. He is gone, but his voice remains, quiet, stubborn, and true. Chapter 7. Truth and the Writer's Burden. By the late 1940s, George Orwell was more than a novelist. He had become a conscience. Though physically frail and often ill, Orwell's ideas had grown stronger, sharper, and more widely known. His name became associated with moral courage, independent thinking, and the refusal to accept lies, no matter who told them. Orwell's journey toward becoming a voice of reason had been slow, shaped by pain, war, and self-education. Unlike many literary giants of his time, he did not belong to elite salons or powerful political circles. He did not court wealth or fame. He had never been a man of the establishment. His power came from something else, his honesty. This honesty, however, made Orwell many enemies. He had once supported socialism, believing it could create a fairer world. But after seeing how political systems twisted ideals into tools of control, he refused to remain silent. In Animal Farm, he criticized the betrayal of revolutionary ideals in the Soviet Union. In 1984, he warned of a world where truth itself could be rewritten. Some on the political left felt betrayed. They believed Orwell had given fuel to their enemies. Others accused him of being too negative, too harsh. But Orwell never attacked socialism as an ideal, only the way it was being used as a mask for tyranny. His essays in this period showed a mind unwilling to be silent. In Politics and the English Language, Orwell dissected the way politicians and writers abused language. He showed how vague phrases, clichés, and euphemisms were used to hide violence and injustice. He wrote, "Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable." To Orwell, language was not neutral. Words could be used to reveal truth or to destroy it. This belief became one of the pillars of his work. He wanted people to see clearly, to name things honestly, and to resist manipulation. In a world recovering from fascism and entering the Cold War, Orwell's warnings felt timely and necessary. Though often physically isolated on Jura or in hospitals, Orwell was never far from the center of public debate. He exchanged letters with fellow writers like T.S. Eliot, Arthur Koestler, and Cyril Connolly. Some admired him, others feared his bluntness, but all respected his mind. One of Orwell's most important relationships during this time was with Partisan Review, a New York-based magazine that welcomed his essays and helped spread his ideas in America. Through this platform, his work reached academics, journalists, and students who would carry his warnings into the next generation. Yet, even as Orwell gained influence, he remained deeply aware of his own limits. He did not see himself as a prophet or hero. He often called himself a man of the left, but warned against blind loyalty to any ideology. He believed in decency, fairness, and individual freedom, but not in utopia. Orwell had little patience for intellectual games. He believed that ideas should serve real people, not just impress fellow thinkers. He once wrote that some intellectuals disliked the working class as much as the rich did, but hid their disdain behind big words and slogans. This made Orwell unusual. He could speak to both educated readers and everyday workers. He respected intelligence, but he hated pretension. In personal letters, he often worried that people misunderstood his books. Animal Farm, he wrote, was not anti-revolution. It was anti-corruption. 1984 was not a prediction, but a warning. It showed what could happen if people gave up their right to think freely. The themes of surveillance, censorship, and propaganda in 1984 struck a nerve in post-war society. As the Cold War deepened, readers across the West saw the novel as a defense of democracy against authoritarianism. In the East, banned copies of Orwell's work were secretly passed from hand to hand. Orwell never saw the full global impact of his writing. His health declined too quickly. But he understood one thing clearly, that words have power. He often described himself as a failure, not because of pride, but because he believed he could never fully live up to the truth he sought. He once wrote that he wanted to make political writing an art. He came close. His plain, forceful style became a model for generations of journalists, essayists, and thinkers. As the 1950s began, Orwell's name was increasingly used in public discussions. His term Orwellian began to appear, not always with precision, but always with weight. It became shorthand for systems of control, false history, and lost freedom. Ironically, Orwell would have disliked having a term named after him. He distrusted fame. He believed that writers should not seek power, only truth. He once said, "To see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle." That struggled to find Orwell's life. He tried to look clearly at the world, even when the view was painful. He wanted others to do the same. Near the end of his life, Orwell left behind notes and fragments for other books he never got to finish. Some of them suggested a return to Burma. Others hinted at exploring the rise of modern advertising or the effects of mass media, but his time was running out. His final achievement was not just his books, but the example of his life. The effort to write clearly, think independently, and live with courage in a world full of compromise. By 1950, the world had begun to change again. The shadow of World War II was fading, replaced by new fears, nuclear war, political division, the battle between East and West. In this world, Orwell's ideas continued to echo. His name was now associated with honesty in an age of deception. His books were discussed in classrooms, parliaments, and underground reading circles. Young readers found in him not just a writer, but a guide, a figure who showed that resistance could begin with a pen. Chapter 8. The Last Battle. By the time George Orwell completed 1984, he was already dying. His lungs, weakened by years of hardship, war, and poverty, had been taken over by tuberculosis, a disease he had quietly battled for years. Writing had become painful. Typing for hours in the damp air of Jura had left him cold, fatigued, and often gasping for breath. But Orwell believed this book had to be finished. He once told a friend that the world needed to hear what he had to say before he left it. In late 1948, the final manuscript of 1984 was sent to his publisher. Orwell was so weak that he could barely stand. He corrected proofs while lying in a hospital bed, coughing and feverish, but mentally sharp. He demanded changes, questioned karmas, and defended his vision of a future shaped by lies, surveillance, and fear. When the novel was published in June 1949, it caused an immediate stir. Big Brother is watching you. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. These phrases entered the public imagination like lightning. The book was chilling, dystopian, and unlike anything readers had seen before. It wasn't just fiction, it was a warning, a mirror held up to the political realities of the 20th century. Totalitarian regimes in Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia had already shown how truth could be twisted. Orwell simply pushed the logic further. The reception was powerful and mixed. To many in the West, 1984 felt like a necessary alarm. It exposed how language, media, and fear could be used to control populations. The idea of doublethink, believing two contradictory things at the same time, suddenly became a key concept in political discussion. Newspeak, the fictional language of the regime in the novel, became a symbol of how governments could erase meaning from words. To others, especially on the political left, the book felt like a betrayal. Orwell, a lifelong socialist, seemed to be attacking the very ideas he once supported, but this view misunderstood his purpose. Orwell was not against socialism. He was against authoritarianism, no matter which side it came from. He didn't believe power should go unquestioned, even when held by those who claimed to fight for justice. The book's success spread quickly. In America, it became a bestseller. In Britain, it was reviewed in every major newspaper. Critics praised its courage and clarity, though some complained it was too dark, too hopeless. Orwell was invited to give radio talks, lectures, and interviews, but he was too sick to accept. He remained in the hospital, writing letters, reading reviews, and reflecting on what might come next. He had hoped to leave Jura behind and recover in a warmer climate, Plans were made to send him to Switzerland, but his health deteriorated too quickly. By the end of 1949, he was in University College Hospital in London. Friends visited when they could, though Orwell never liked being fussed over. One of his last visitors was Sonia Brownell, a literary editor and friend. In a surprising decision, Orwell proposed to her. They married in October 1949, just 3 months before his death. Some believed the marriage was a final act of hope, a way to resist the closing dark. Others said he simply didn't want to die alone. In those last months, Orwell continued to think, read, and edit. He spoke of future books. He worried about how 1984 would be misread. He once said, "Every line of serious work I have written since 1936 has been written, directly or indirectly, against totalitarianism." He never claimed to be perfect. He never asked to be trusted blindly. What he wanted, above all, was for people to think, to resist easy answers and question official truths. On January 21, 1950, George Orwell died at the age of 46. The official cause was a burst artery in his lungs. He had spent most of his adult life fighting illness, injustice, and his own doubts. But he had never stopped writing. His death came quietly, without ceremony. There was no grand funeral. He was buried in a small village cemetery in Oxfordshire, under his real name, Eric Arthur Blair. His tombstone said simply that he was an author. That was enough. But the world did not forget him. In the years after his death, Orwell's work continued to grow in influence. Animal Farm and 1984 were translated into dozens of languages. Underground copies were smuggled into the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. In China, students read him in secret. In America, his books became part of school curricula. His warnings were studied by political scientists, historians, and activists. Orwellian became a permanent part of the English language, sometimes misused, sometimes overused, but always meaningful. Orwell's greatness did not lie in prediction. He did not claim to see the future. Instead, he studied the present with clarity. He showed how fear, control, and dishonesty could destroy a society from within. He believed that freedom was fragile and that defending it required constant effort. He once said, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." This spirit, defiant, honest, and deeply human, remains Orwell's legacy. As the 20th century moved into the 21st, Orwell's books felt more relevant than ever. In a world of fake news, surveillance technologies, and manipulated narratives, his voice continues to warn us. Not as a prophet, but as a man who tried, despite illness, poverty, and isolation, to tell the truth. And in doing so, he gave generations of readers the tools to think for themselves. Chapter 9. A Voice That Would Not Die. When George Orwell died in 1950, few could have predicted how deeply his words would echo across the decades. Though he had never sought fame, Orwell became one of the most widely read political writers of the 20th century. Animal Farm and 1984 continued to sell in vast numbers, their relevance increasing with each new political crisis. Orwell was gone, but his ideas lived on, twisted, celebrated, debated, and even weaponized. During the Cold War, Orwell became a figure claimed by both sides. In the West, particularly in the United States and Britain, Animal Farm was embraced as a critique of communism. Its allegorical attack on the Soviet Union fit neatly into the anti-Soviet atmosphere of the time. Schools taught it as a moral lesson. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. The CIA even secretly funded an animated film version of Animal Farm in 1954 to promote anti-communist messages around the world. At the same time, 1984 was read as a terrifying vision of what could happen if totalitarianism went unchecked. Orwell's concepts, Big Brother, Newspeak, thought crime, and doublethink became part of everyday language. Political commentators, journalists, and protesters used his phrases to criticize censorship, propaganda, and government surveillance. But Orwell's own political beliefs were often misunderstood. He had fought against fascism in Spain. He had criticized Stalinism with fierce clarity. Yet he remained a democratic socialist to the end. He believed in economic fairness, freedom of speech, and the right to challenge authority. He hated tyranny in all its forms, whether from the left or right. But in the Cold War environment, nuance was often lost. Orwell was sometimes treated as an anti-socialist crusader, something he never was. This misuse of Orwell's work disturbed his friends. Some felt his memory was being reshaped to fit political goals he would have rejected. Others argued that Orwell would have preferred misinterpretation over silence. At least people were still reading, still thinking. In the decades that followed, Orwell's relevance only grew. In the 1960s and 1970s, Orwell's reputation expanded beyond politics into education and literature. Universities around the world began studying his essays and novels not only for their political insight, but also for their literary value. His clear prose style, love of the English language, and belief in truth as a moral duty made him a model for young writers. In Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, Animal Farm and 1984 were often banned, but this only increased interest. Copies were smuggled in and read in secret. Orwell became a symbol of resistance. To those living under repressive regimes, his words offered both warning and hope. In 1984, the year itself, readers returned to Orwell in force. Many feared that the future he had warned about was arriving. Governments were expanding surveillance powers. New technologies allowed for the tracking of individuals. Language was increasingly shaped by media and ideology. Across the globe, people asked, was Orwell right? That same year, dozens of books, articles, and documentaries re-examined his life and work. Critics and fans debated what Orwell would have thought about modern democracy, mass media, and digital culture. Everyone seemed to have a different opinion, but all agreed that Orwell still mattered. As time passed, Orwell's work adapted to each new era. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the rise of the internet and global terrorism brought fresh concerns. Governments introduced mass surveillance programs. News channels became more partisan. Alternative facts and conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. Orwell's ideas found new life. The adjective Orwellian was used everywhere, from headlines to social media posts, to describe anything seen as controlling, deceptive, or anti-democratic. But even as his legacy grew, questions remained. Who owned Orwell's message? Was he simply a political prophet, a literary genius, a moral philosopher? Perhaps the answer lay in his complexity. Orwell was never a man of easy answers. He distrusted both blind optimism and despair. He once wrote that the first duty of intelligent men is the restatement of the obvious. In a world full of lies, saying something simple like 2 + 2 = 4 could be an act of courage. His work didn't tell readers what to think, it told them to think. In this way, Orwell became a kind of mirror. People saw in him what they wanted to see. Some saw a hero of freedom. Others saw a warning against ideology. Some read him to understand politics. Others read him to become better writers. His simplicity was deceptive. Beneath the clear sentences lay deep moral complexity. In 2003, Orwell's complete works were republished, including his letters, essays, and diaries. Readers were struck by his honesty, self-doubt, and tireless curiosity. He was no saint. He could be harsh, judgmental, and stubborn, but he always tried to see things as they were. More recently, Orwell's ideas have reached new generations. In China, dissidents quote 1984 in online forums. In Russia, Animal Farm remains a favorite among reform-minded youth. In the United States and Europe, Orwell's books are used in protests, university debates, and journalism courses. In some classrooms, students read Orwell to understand their own governance. In others, to understand the nature of truth itself. George Orwell died young, but his voice never faded. Even today, in an age of artificial intelligence, climate crisis, and digital manipulation, his insights remain sharp. Orwell never lived to see the internet. He never imagined smartphones, social media, or algorithmic propaganda. Yet he seemed to understand that truth, once distorted, could become the most dangerous weapon of all. In 2021, over 70 years after his death, 1984 was once again among the most downloaded books online. Why? Because Orwell had warned us about a world where reality could be rewritten, and that world, many feel, is no longer fiction. Chapter 10. The Legacy of a Reluctant Prophet. George Orwell never saw himself as a prophet. He was, in his own eyes, a writer struggling to tell the truth in a world increasingly filled with lies. And yet, more than 70 years after his death, Orwell remains one of the most prophetic voices of the modern age. His legacy is not built on wealth or fame. He left behind no fortune, no great institutions, no school of followers. Instead, he left behind something far more powerful: clarity, a clarity of thought, of language, and of moral purpose. In Orwell's view, writing was a tool not for decoration, but for truth-telling. He once wrote, "Good prose is like a window pane. Through this window, readers could see reality, not as it was presented by propaganda or distorted by ideology, but as it actually existed." This belief in the importance of truth made Orwell deeply concerned about language. In his famous essay Politics and the English Language, he warned how words could be used to hide lies, confuse the public, and excuse cruelty. Phrases like collateral damage or enhanced interrogation could make violence seem clean. Bureaucratic jargon could drain meaning from life. For Orwell, clear language was the first defense against tyranny. This is why 1984 remains so powerful. The novel is not just about a future dictatorship. It is about how language, history, and memory can be controlled to manipulate people. It warns that if we accept falsehoods, repeat lies, and forget what is true, we will lose not only freedom, but our very sense of self. In that terrifying world, 2 + 2 = 5 becomes not just a lie, but a test of loyalty. For Orwell, the most dangerous thing was not a gun, but a lie believed by millions. Orwell's legacy can also be seen in how we think about government power. Whenever leaders try to limit free speech, rewrite the past, or watch their citizens too closely, Orwell's name returns to the conversation. His ideas live in phrases like Orwellian, Big Brother, and thought crime. These are not just literary terms. They are cultural warnings. But Orwell's influence goes beyond politics. He has shaped how generations of writers, thinkers, and everyday citizens think about ethics, responsibility, and the role of the individual in society. He believed that everyone, not just politicians or intellectuals, had a duty to resist lies and stand up for truth. This belief made him deeply respected, even by those who disagreed with his politics. His essays continue to inspire, whether writing about colonialism, poverty, or censorship. Orwell combined logic with empathy. He could criticize an idea without hating the person. He could see the flaws in both the systems he fought against and the ones he supported. This honesty made him rare and valuable. Today, in a world of social media, deepfakes, and endless noise, Orwell's voice remains a guide. He reminds us that freedom is not guaranteed. It must be protected, not just by laws, but by ordinary people choosing to speak the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. He reminds us that language matters, that when we change the meaning of words, we risk losing reality itself. He also reminds us that writing is more than art. It is action. Through his own life, Orwell demonstrated the power of a single voice. He was not wealthy, powerful, or even especially healthy, but he was brave. He refused to look away from suffering. He chose to go to war, to live among the poor, to speak against both the right and the left when necessary. His courage was quiet, but fierce. His final years were lonely and painful, yet even as he was dying, he finished 1984, knowing that it was his duty to write it. Not because it would make him famous, but because the world needed a warning. That sense of moral urgency defines his legacy more than any single book. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Orwell is that he never asked to be followed. He never claimed to have all the answers. He simply asked us to look at the world and to think. To see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle, he once wrote. In a time when truth is often buried under headlines, opinions, and digital confusion, this struggle is more important than ever. Orwell gives us the tools, not just to read, but to resist, not just to understand history, but to protect the future. And so, George Orwell remains not just a writer of the past, but a voice for our time and for times still to come. Let us keep reading him. Let us keep listening. Let us keep telling the truth. Thanks for learning with Coo English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.